Shalom! Okay, now this should hopefully be working just fine. So, to explain what I am doing here, um, I've been working on a video which is probably going to end up being top 3 surprising things about Christianity uh, that I have learned. And I this video started coming together both as a result of trying to figure out exactly what I was going to do there, and because of discussions we're having on both my Discord server and the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, and basically and some videos that people have been making, and so I decided that maybe I need to give some history, hopefully some useful history, about both the relationship between how people view Paul, who I jokingly refer to and kind of not jokingly refer to as Baal of Tarsus, uh, because it's hard enough to decide whether to call him Saul or Paul, but there's also the whole, how exactly do you view Paul, right? And there's the problem of when you talk about Paul on the Bridges of Meaning server, it's not actually quite clear which Paul you're talking about, Paul Vanderklay or Paul of Tarsus. So, let's get into it. This is a classical depiction of Ecclesia et Synagoga, the church and the synagogue. On the left, you see the church, which is depicted as a proud woman wearing a crown with her standard held high. And on the right is synagoga, which is her staff is broken, she's blindfolded, she's actually dropping the Torah. And this is a very classic image. It's a very classic way of viewing the relationship between the church and the synagogue, or between the Gentiles and the Jews. So I'm going to explain the traditional view, which is basically the view that has that developed traditionally within Christianity through history, and certainly by the time of the Reformation, it had become a universal view among Catholics, among Protestants, and the Eastern Orthodox. This was considered the Christian way of looking at the relationship between God, the church, and the synagogue, as in the Christians and the Jews. In the 1800s and 1900s, as academic study, secular academic study picked up, there was a very different view of the history of Christianity, the interrelationship between Jews and Gentiles developed. And I'm just making sure I have okay. The relationship between Jews and Christians developed, and this academic view was very, very different. as this academic view started seeping into Christianity, something very different also happened, which was the Holocaust and the reaction within Christianity to the Holocaust, and an attempt by Christians to both consider what this view of ecclesia et synagoga meant for Christians internally, religiously, as well as externally. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that these new perspectives are merely the result of political correctness or an attempt to make peace with the Jews. And certainly there's plenty of people who think they're just part of the Jewish control of the Christian church. And that's that's partially because so many Christians don't actually discuss what that means, why these views have changed, and the fact that these views have changed among themselves. Part of the reason I am making this video and the other video is the discussion that Pastor Tanner was having with Paul Vanderklay over the ability of Christians to discuss their theology with each other, which is one of the surprising things I'm going to be discussing. Is there is a real fear of heresy within Christianity, which makes speculation about different ways of viewing things very dangerous. I mean, certainly among Protestants, you can be thrown out of your church for having the wrong views, and this it's a very scary idea. I mean, I had no idea that Christians were this afraid of discussing things. So what exactly the new perspective is being worked out, certainly among academics and people who are more willing to discuss things, but to some extent they're also only being discussed in hushed tones. The new perspectives that are developing, I don't believe receive the amount of discussion that certainly they would within Judaism, but that I think the laity within Christianity need. And there's a question, even, the laity within Christianity have a lot more freedom as they do in Judaism. I mean, a rabbi, there's only certain things that a rabbi can say and remain a rabbi, whereas the laity are able to discuss things a lot more. And the same is true within Christianity, but the clerical class can, there's a real fear there, whereas really within Judaism, certainly within Reform and Conservative, and even among Orthodox Judaism, there isn't the emphasis on orthodoxy as opposed to orthopraxy. And so having divergent views are much more tolerated within Judaism than they are within Protestantism, at least. There definitely is a diversity of views among the Eastern Orthodox, but part of that is because the Eastern Orthodox are so divided. And even within Catholicism, so one of the new perspective that Vatican II brought. Now, my experience has been that generally today, people who are discussing Vatican II oftentimes are talking about the Latin Mass and those reforms. But there is certainly a group of Christians, Catholics specifically, not to say that Catholics aren't Christians, because saying that is crazy. There certainly were Catholics whose main bone to pick with Vatican II was the change in this view of the relationship between the church and the synagogue. One of the things that Vatican II said is that the old covenant, right, and we're going to discuss what exactly the traditional view was, but that God's promises to Israel were not completely forgotten, and it declares that it is a mystery how Jews and other people can be saved outside the church. And many people found this completely unacceptable. The idea that it was possible to find salvation outside the Roman Catholic Church is something that a lot of traditionalists still find very unacceptable. But these new perspectives, as opposed to the traditional view, are in fact what is officially espoused by, I would say, almost all churches. And to some extent, the people who don't espouse these new perspectives find themselves feeling muzzled, and I don't think there is the proper explanation of what is problematic within Christianity about the traditional view, because it can be so explosive. So we're going to go through it and explain, I think what should hopefully help clarify Unfortunately, I think a lot of Christians simply do not know what is going on within their own church. And part of that is because there are discussions we cannot have out loud. You can look at the old picture of church and synagogue, and look at the new picture of church and synagogue. And this is the new imagery, which ostensibly all of Christianity has accepted and has become normative. The connection between the two is not obvious, and it's not often discussed. And that's what my hope is to actually do here. So let's take a look at what the traditional view was. The traditional view said that salvation was exclusive to the church. Your church. If you were Roman Catholic, it was those churches that were in communion with the Bishop of Rome, and outside the church was damnation. Same thing among Protestants. The Catholics were going to hell. And the Eastern Orthodox as well believed that if you were not part of their church, you were going to hell. Salvation is only through Jesus. Obviously, today, saying such a thing, believing such a thing, is controversial. It's not the official position of any major church, as far as I know, much less many. Supersessionism. So a few years ago, Ann Coulter displayed that she thought supersessionism was still an acceptable view within Christianity. And everybody blew up at her. And her response was, yes, I'm a Christian. I believe that salvation for all people is through Jesus. Many, many people tried to educate her about the fact that supersessionism is oftentimes called anti-Semitism today. It's certainly anti-Judaism. Many, many people will say that supersessionism is anti-Semitism. Supersessionism, sometimes it's referred to as replacement theology, is the idea that God had a covenant with the Jews. Jesus came. He was rejected by the Jews. The Jews were guilty of deicide. They rejected God. God rejected the Jews. A new church was established. A new Israel was established, and Christians were now Israel. So when they looked at the Bible, especially what's considered the Old Testament, all of the promises that were given in the Old Testament by God were now transferred to the church, were transferred to the new Israel, which was the Christians. I, as a Jew, as somebody who is not baptized, who is not a Christian, am no longer Jewish. So when the Bible refers to Jews, when the Bible refers to Israel, it's not referring to me, it's not referring to Israel as the people who actually are the Jewish people, the descendants of the Jews. No, we're not Jews anymore. We're not actually Israel. We're people we are the synagogue. We are the blind and dejected. We are the ones who, and a lot of Christians believe this, were there to show what happens when you reject God. Why were the Jews these miserable people that everybody hated? Because they rejected Jesus. And this is what happens to you when you reject Jesus. I've made a video. My video on anti-Semitism explains the difference between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. So Christianity is a different religion from Judaism. Anti-Judaism, generally, everyone would agree, is an integral part of Christianity. If you just accepted Judaism, then you would no longer be Christians, you would be Jews, right? So the separation between Christianity and Judaism comes from the fact that Christianity is a different religion from Judaism. We have our disagreements, and that's fine. That's anti-Judaism. Anti-Judaism, while some people will argue that it's anti-Semitism, it's not anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism it applies to Jews regardless of their religion. So, famous story, now Catholic saint, she was, I forget her name, I'm sorry, I should have looked it up, but she was a Jew who converted to Catholicism. She became a nun. She was taken as a nun, wearing her habit, onto the trains and was murdered during the Holocaust. That's anti-Semitism. What happened during the Inquisition was anti-Semitism, because a lot of the people, in fact, most of the people who were actually murdered were ostensibly Christians. They had been baptized, and they were considered recalcitrant Christians because they may or might not even have been reverting to Judaizing, to becoming Jews again, which was a rejection of the church, which is why they were being prosecuted and persecuted. Anti-Semitism is not based on what a person believes. It's based on the fact that that person is Jewish. You can't change your beliefs and put yourself outside of the reach of anti-Semitism. It's your immutable characteristics which are being targeted. Okay? And the traditional view actually viewed the Judaizers as being the Jews and did not view them as Christians. Obviously now, with our historical background, it's very clear to see and understand that actually, no, the Judaizers were Jewish Christians that were rejecting the teachings of Paul. But that was not the traditional view of it. The traditional view was, oh, these people want to go back to being Jewish. They are rejecting Christianity, because Paul was considered the teacher. Paul, not Jesus. And a lot of people have a lot of difficulty when I try to explain this to them. They certainly don't believe me. And that's why I wanted to show you this video, which Sam recently made. So this is Sam discussing with Isaiah Burridge the difference between dispensationalism and covenantal theology. You certainly recommend watching the whole video, but I absolutely blew my lid at this point, because they were discussing something that I think a lot of Christians are not willing to admit. So here goes.
For dispensational?
No, I'm not hyper dispensational, and honestly, like, I feel like some of the downsides of dispensationalism, especially hyper dispensationalism, like my least favorite aspect of it is that it's like, well, when Jesus was alive, around and talking, he was just talking to the people of Israel, right? Right, and really, he wasn't exactly preaching to the church. It's not like what he's saying is completely irrelevant or something like that, but we're just reading something that was actually not to us, and really, it's the post-Pentecost epistle age, right? And especially the Pauline epistles, like
Also to the Gentiles, and that's when, like, I've heard some people say Gospels aren't irrelevant to us, but he wasn't speaking like us.
Yeah, right.
And we need to follow Paul, and it's like, that feels weird.
Yeah.
Why can't Paul and Jesus be on the same? I do believe the lost house of Israel tried to draft them in, no doubt, but he was rejected by his people and healed the Gentile girl. I mean, he went to certain Gentiles and barbaric, like the Samaritan woman.
By barbaric to the Jews, he means offensive to the Jews.
Confess his identity to the. That's like a whoa, like Samaritan. She's a woman. This is so anti-Jew. Not even funny. I think Jesus' whole mission, while it was relevant to, I can read the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and get how I'm supposed to live my life.
Yeah. It's the inauguration of the kingdom covenant, yes. Right? And like that kind of covenantal stuff, I kind of like, because in a certain way, like covenantalism and dispensationalism both agree that there was sort of a change, right? It's just like how many changes and what are the stipulations of the different changes and how the different parts of the Bible fit into that.
Covenant theology, guys, way Old and New.
Yeah.
They see that circumcision is now baptism.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, if the child was circumcised, baptize the child. Like,
so you can watch the rest of that on their page, on that page, and I certainly do recommend it. But so what was going on there is Jesus came, he spoke to the Jews, he was trying to reach out to the Jews, right? The Jews rejected Jesus. The Jews made the Romans murder Jesus. The Jews were rejected by God, and a new covenant came into being after Jesus' resurrection. This was a new church founded by Paul, who was the apostle to the Gentiles. And while Paul had to deal with the Judaizers, these were people who didn't quite understand everything that had changed. And the fact that what Paul was saying may not have agreed with what Jesus had taught was not a problem, because Jesus came to speak to the Jews. The Jews rejected him, and so the life of Jesus described in the Gospels was not really Jesus teaching to everyone. Now, what happened when there was the secular academic study of the Bible that started in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, is they started looking at the Bible first by saying, we're not going to automatically believe that everything that the Bible says is true. We're going to look at other forms of evidence to try to figure out how did the Bible, Christian history develop, and how did Christianity actually, what actually happened 2,000 years ago, not necessarily what the Bible that we have now says about what happened 2,000 years ago. There was an inherent rejection of the New Testament. Oftentimes, the mere fact that it was what was in the Greek Bible was reason enough to reject it, and a critical look was taken to the Christian Bible. First, by looking at Roman history outside of how it was described by the Christian Bible, by the Greek Bible. The Christian Bible describes a world in which, and this was really shocking to me, the Jews were very powerful. The Romans were very, very nice people. The Jews were constantly trying to murder everyone who's good. The Jews, and this word, the Jews, right, being used in that manner, like I just remember the first time I was watching Father Eric reading from the Bible during a service, and he was reading from the Gospel of John, and I was hearing him say, "Fear of the Jews." Like, what? and I go look this verse up, and it's like, okay, this is from the Gospels, right? And supposedly, there's this really funny comic, right, where it like that, Peter is hiding from the Jews, and somebody's like, but Peter, you're Jewish. Right? How's Peter hiding from the Jews? Right? How can the apostles be hiding from the Jews? Right? And so this view of the early followers of Jesus not themselves being the Jews, right? If you're going to look at it in a secular manner, obviously you're going to find some problem with the way that is being described. So people started looking at Josephus, who was a Jew who wrote extensively about the history of the Roman rule in what was called Palestine, and the other historical facts that we had at the time, looking and trying to figure out what actually happened at the time. And a very different view came into vogue, which was Jesus, like all the other messiahs that are described in Josephus was a revolutionary. When you look at the history, the secular history outside of what we have in the Greek Bible, to understand what was going on, there was the Roman Empire. The Romans were very, very strong. They militarily took over the land of Israel from the Maccabees. Herod, who his mother was a Nabatean, apparently they referred to themselves as a Benjaminite, right? And I mean, I won't get into the whole thing about who's a Jew and who's a Benjaminite and who's Israel and who's a Galilean and all of that stuff. That's a whole video. But when Herod came to Jerusalem to take power, one of the first things he did was take the Sanhedrin, which had 71 members, and kill half the people on the Sanhedrin. He just murdered them. The vision that is portrayed in the Gospels, which, you know, to the point where there are Christians who seriously believe that, Pilate is now a saint, you know, in the Ethiopian church, I believe it is. There are, you know, when you read the accounts, they're farcical. In fact, to the point where the one accounting of how the Gospels came to be what they are is that, in fact, they were samizdat. So samizdat, the term comes from the Russian. When you are publishing material that is against the state, one of the ways in which you hide it is by saying things which ostensibly are true, right? So imagine that I am a Russian, or even somebody in China today, or North Korea, who has to worry about being considered a subversive. Well, one of the ways in which I could say what I want to say and not have it be ostensibly subversive is to talk about how Stalin is such a great man, to the point where somebody who agrees with me would be like, well, it's obviously not true, right? The same way that as we look at the propaganda that comes out of North Korea, obviously we know that the North Korean regime is not, incredibly nice, giving food to everyone, and it's quite possible that actually the portrayal of the Romans we have for the early Christians was obviously untrue, right? All the Romans are really nice, right? Pilate, he definitely doesn't want to kill Jesus. His hands are being forced. The idea of a centurion building a synagogue. If a centurion was so nice to Christians and Jews, that centurion would cease to be a centurion pretty darn quick, right? So if you're going to look at the secular history of 2,000 years ago, the idea that the Jews forced the Romans to kill a Jew is ridiculous. Jesus wasn't just crucified with two other people, right? The killing of the innocents, right? The massacre of the little babies by Herod, that was believable to most people because he was a Roman, right? The estimates are that tens of thousands of Jews, possibly 100,000 Jews, were crucified under the Romans. Josephus actually says that the Romans were just grabbing 500 Jews every day and crucifying them, to the point where they ran out of wood to make more crosses. And if they had the wood, they had no place to put the crosses, right? The Romans were brutal, and you don't just have to look at how they ruled Palestine. You can look at how they ruled the rest of their empire. The idea that they were being told what to do is ridiculous. And the fact is that when you look at the history of the time, it's obvious that Romans simply didn't know how to deal with these religious fanatics, as they saw the Jews, who would not bend